Hello, I'm Ed Lark, the producer of The Adventures of the Vikings. I've spent 2 years gathering the most up-to-date and factual information about 3 Scandinavian groups, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, who ruled much of the British Isles, Europe, and Russia between the 8th and the 11th centuries. When the Vikings would go plundering, they would say that they are going Viking. The Danes went Viking south into the British Isles and Europe. The Swedes went eastward into Russia, while the Norwegians went south and west. To understand the Viking era, we must also understand 3 major events that helped to create it, and those events are included in this program. Also, to feature only the adventures of the Vikings and their travels would be incomplete. It's also important to include those enduring legacies that the Vikings have passed on to their 20th century descendants. But now, let's turn back the hands of time 1,000 years to the birth of an era that would change the course of history.
Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were and still are the lands of the Vikings. Although Scandinavia was a beautiful land, it was not always suitable for farming, and those lands that were arable first had to be cleared of boulders. After the spring planting, it was common that the younger men would go on Viking raids during the summer and return home in time for the autumn harvest, often bringing home plunder and slaves. This was life in a Viking village 1,000 years ago. Garments were usually made of hand-woven wool and linen. Women usually wore long outer garments and long hair, often arranged in a knot at the back of the head. School didn't exist. Children were expected to learn a skill. Both blacksmithing and boat building were highly respected skills in the Viking community. An apprentice had to learn how to build an efficient kiln from clay that could produce high-quality iron that could be forged into knives, swords, boat rivets, and plowshares. In spite of the knowledge and skills that the Vikings had in producing iron and various metal alloys, they did not possess the knowledge of glassmaking. The Vikings were limited to remelting broken pieces of glass and casting ornamental beads in containers, which were highly prized in the Viking community. Timbers for homes and boats were fashioned by an axe, and in spite of the simple tools, the Vikings were able to build magnificent Viking ships. Bread was baked in an adobe oven similar to the way the American Indians bake their bread, but with no apparent cultural link between the Vikings and the American Indians. Is it coincidence? Well, the birth of the Viking era began in the 8th century and lasted for 300 years. It evolved because of several factors, 3 of which were especially significant. The population had increased significantly and good farmland was limited. Also, in some areas, it was the tradition to give the farm to the oldest son. Many offspring had to leave their homes to find suitable farmland, which often meant leaving Scandinavia. In the home, woman was boss. Women could inherit land and wealth. The right of divorce belonged to the woman who could divorce any time she wished. Adultery resulted in a man being put to death, while a woman would be sold into slavery. On the other hand, a man could have as many wives and concubines as he could afford. Vikings had very defined rules of etiquette. A Viking proverb states, "A tactful guest will take his leave early and not linger long. He starts to stink who overstays his welcome in a room that is not his own." Besides the problem of overpopulation, the second influence to the birth of the Viking era was the warlike pagan religion. Their gods were numerous. In fact, 4 days of our week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, are all named after pagan gods. The chief of the gods was Odin, and he sacrificed one of his eyes to gain wisdom. Thor, the popular god of thunder. Now, man entered paradise or Valhalla only by dying in battle. The Vikings had various levels of paradise, of which Valhalla was their highest. There the warrior spirits battled all day. At sundown, the victorious, as well as those who fell in battle, would get up and all would joyfully return to Valhalla's huge banquet hall. The Vikings believed that the serpent pictured to the right encircled the world. The warriors would feast from silver platters, and the rest of the night would be spent with their favorite maidens. The next day, it would start all over again for eternity. The third major event that made the Viking era possible was the development of a fast seaworthy boat. At the Viking Boat Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, are partial remains of 5 Viking boats built 1,000 years ago. The cargo boats were wider than the sleek raiding boats and were slower, which made them easy prey for pirates. At the Viking Fair held in Roskilde, Denmark, Scandinavians followed the boat-building methods of the Vikings using the same kinds of tools. The cracks between the mating planks were stuffed with animal hair or wool smeared with tar or whale fat. A boat was considered seaworthy if it didn't leak more than what one man could bale. To fasten their planks together, a metal plate with a hole in it was placed over the protruding rivet and the nail bent over the metal plate. The early Vikings had an ingenious method for making rope from spruce roots, but we don't know how those roots were prepared to give them strength. So modern Vikings are obliged to make rope from hemp. The Vikings also made ropes from walrus and seal skins, which were highly prized among sailors. Viking boat sails were originally made of wool, but here canvas is being used. We have no evidence as to what was displayed on their sails, but it would be reasonable to assume that there were magic symbols on the sails that would ensure a safe voyage. Many Viking boats had symbols of fierce dragon heads on the bows. The sail of a Viking ship was a square rig. With a brisk wind, it could push a sleek raiding ship through the water at 12 knots. They were among the fastest ships on the sea until powerboats were invented. A highlight of the Roskilde Viking Fair is a Viking boat race, and the first boat that can land a crew member back at the dock wins. Well, the reason that made this type of boat so efficient for pirating was not only its speed, but its ability to navigate in as little as 1 meter of water, which meant that a wharf was not needed, but the boat could land on any sandy beach. The Vikings could quickly conduct their raid and be back on board before the villagers could organize a counterattack. It was a very well-designed boat, and it ruled the seas for 300 years. Well, the Viking Fair included a collection of Viking-style tents where modern Vikings may sample the foods of their ancestors. Honey was the Vikings' most common sweetener. Also, their most popular alcoholic beverage, called mead, was made from honey. And although oil lamps are most common, beeswax candles were used on special occasions. From Viking graves, it's clear that the Vikings placed great importance on fine clothes and good grooming. And contrary to popular belief, the Vikings did not put horns on their helmets. Horns were used strictly as drinking goblets. Hollywood and present-day Scandinavians continue to perpetuate this misconception. The Vikings enjoyed a wide variety of games, including one of the most ancient of all games, that is backgammon, dating back 5,000 years. A popular sport was a special brand of Viking-style wrestling which required strength, agility, and cunning, those same qualities that were necessary in battle. The winners always attracted more than a fair share of admiring maidens. Viking tents were supported by a wooden A-frame with typical Viking designs. Colorful pagan symbols also decorated the sides of the tents. Mossgård, Denmark hosts one of Scandinavia's largest Viking festivals, and visitors from Scandinavia, Europe, and North America sample Viking-style roast pork and traditional thin bread. While children may have used a horn as a drinking cup, the horn most often contained mead, the Vikings' most popular alcoholic beverage. Swords, helmets, and other Viking artifacts are for sale to souvenir collectors. A highlight of the Viking festival at Mossgård is a recreation of a Viking battle. A parade of special Viking horses signals the beginning of an impending battle. It was common for a representative from each opposing side to meet and discuss their demands and possibly reach a peaceful settlement. If that failed, everyone knew what would follow. To die in battle was the ultimate wish of every Viking warrior, for that assured immediate access to Valhalla. The battle ended with the victorious Vikings staging a mock attack on the spectators. Denmark has many examples of its Viking past. Trelleborg was a large fortress built in the 10th century. The immense rampart was built in an exact circle with 4 gateways to the inner courtyard positioned at the compass quadrants. But the Vikings had no knowledge of the compass in the 10th century. How did they do it? No one knows. The 20-foot high and 50-foot thick rampart protected 16 large buildings, whose post holes are all that remain. This was a major military camp for the Viking armies. The buildings were long halls made of wood and in the shape of a Viking boat turned upside down. In any event, the Danish Vikings learned that there were riches and slaves to be taken from the undefended villages and monasteries that lie south of them in Scotland and England. The monastery at Holy Island, known as Lindisfarne, was the site of the first recorded Viking raid in 793. Every 6 hours the tides around Holy Island cover the linking causeway to the mainland. Consequently, visitors to Holy Island can travel only during low tide. The Norse raids became so frequent throughout the British Isles that the prayers of the peasants included the appeal, "O Lord, deliver us from the fury of the Norsemen." And since the Vikings did not have a literary language, the written reports of the viciousness of the Vikings were recorded by the victims, probably somewhat exaggerated. Certainly the Vikings were no worse than what was occurring throughout the rest of Europe during that period. But the Vikings acquired the greatest notoriety, perhaps because of their pagan beliefs and their raids upon Christian sanctuaries. The Danish Vikings discovered that the monasteries were unprotected and were easy prey. The abbey and church at Coldingham, Scotland, was another casualty of the Viking raids. And when there wasn't enough plunder to satisfy the raiders, they would capture maidens and able-bodied men and sell them into slavery. And slavery was common everywhere 1,000 years ago, and was not unique to the Vikings. The Viking raids reached farther south into Ireland and England. In 866 they traveled up the Ouse River to an ancient town founded by the Romans called Eboracum. The Vikings took over the town and turned it into one of the greatest commercial centers in Europe. It was given the Viking name Jorvik, later to become anglicized as York. Cattle grazed the green fields that the Vikings passed, and they knew that this was a good place to settle. Beneath the streets of York are the remains of the ancient city of Jorvik, plus a partial reconstruction of this Viking community, an interior of a Viking home. The remains were so well preserved that Viking life could be reconstructed as it looked 1,000 years ago. The mannequins helped to show what one would expect to see while walking through Jorvik. Under the Vikings, Jorvik became a major producer of coins. The faces of the mannequins are, of course, artist concepts, except one. And from one of many skulls found here, scientists using laser scanning and a computer were able to reconstruct how the person actually looked. Other faces are gradually being added, and adjacent to the reconstructed Viking village is the actual archaeological site showing well-preserved timbers and wattle fences. Well, ancient Jorvik has become a highlight of York. In fact, there's a growing interest in the Viking era all through Europe and the British Isles. Viking symbols and souvenirs are everywhere. In the 11th century, after the Vikings had been driven out of York, William the Conqueror built a wooden tower on this site because of the view that it offered. Later, it was replaced by this stone tower. The legacies from the past have been carefully preserved here in York, which is one of the most interesting and charming cities in all of England. The old Roman wall, as well as numerous gate entrances, give us a flavor of York as it existed during the Viking rule. Although the construction of York's magnificent cathedral wasn't started until the 13th century, Christians worshipped on this site long before the arrival of the Vikings. Today it is one of the great religious landmarks of England. In the square adjacent to the cathedral, aspiring sidewalk artists demonstrate their talent for the passing public. The old town with its crooked buildings and narrow streets exhibit a flavor of life that grew out of the Viking influence. For about 100 years, starting in the 9th century, the Vikings ruled much of Scotland and England and Ireland, but the Viking armies had spread themselves so thinly that they could no longer control many of the areas they had conquered. Finally, in 1066, a Frenchman of Viking ancestry made claim to the English throne. He won a decisive victory at the Battle of Hastings. His name, William the Conqueror. That ended Viking rule in England, but the Vikings left a legacy for the people of the British Isles that survives to this day. Well, during the 9th century, much of France was overrun by the Vikings, who also laid siege to Paris. After a year, in order to break that siege, the Vikings were given carte blanche to the province of Burgundy, plus 700 pounds of silver. Later, in the 10th century, the French ruler offered the Vikings a grant of land in the northwest of his country if they would agree to settle there. The area became known as Normandy, for the Norse people who occupied it. And compared to the rugged lands of Scandinavia, Normandy looked like paradise. There was abundant fertile land, and wildlife abounded in the forests. Even today, the French have created a wildlife park that preserves a bit of wilderness, perhaps as the Vikings may have seen it. Cattle were common during the Viking era, and Normandy was noted for its dairy products and beef. The abbey and magnificent church of Jumièges stands in ruins today, destroyed by Viking invaders. It was from here in Normandy in 1066 that a fourth-generation Viking descendant conquered England. He became known as William the Conqueror. Danish Viking adventures didn't end here. They continued south into Spain, the islands of the Mediterranean, Italy, and North Africa. Although the Swedish Vikings were as infamous as their neighbors, today's Swedes are among the most pacifistic people in the world. This modern society has been able to avoid wars for over 180 years. Their last major conflict was in 1814. The 1 million Swedes in this modern city of Stockholm enjoy one of the highest standards of living in the world. Prosperity is everywhere. Busy shoppers, store shelves stocked with luxuries, leisure time, and automobile-crowded streets. But only a few blocks away, one can take a delightful stroll into history through Gamla Stan, which is Old Town Stockholm. Although Old Town does not date back as far as the Vikings, it does give us a glimpse of life as it was 4 centuries ago. As you step through the portals of centuries-old facades, you pass through 400 years of time to modern art galleries, expensive boutiques, and fine restaurants. Today, to have an address in Old Town is a sign of prestige. Not far from Stockholm in the Baltic is the island of Gotland and its ancient town of Visby. People have lived on this island for 7,000 years. Visby's stone rampart and ancient gates provided much security for its inhabitants, and during the Viking period, Visby was a wealthy trading center. Gotland's St. Catherine's Cathedral was built in the 11th century at the end of the Viking era. The acceptance of Christianity by the Scandinavians was an important event that contributed to the demise of the Viking era. Boulders placed in the shape of a Viking ship represent a gravesite or monument. Near Ystad in southern Sweden, boulders weighing several tons each were moved to this spot to form the shape of a huge Viking ship. Within its borders is a simple gravestone, and such pagan monuments and graves are found throughout all of Scandinavia. While the Vikings did not have a literary language, they did use a runic alphabet to record adventures, battles, deaths, ownership of property, poems, magic spells, and even jokes. This large ruin stone from Gotland states he was betrayed by Wallachians on his visit abroad, which was in southern Romania. May God help Rodfus's soul, and may God betray those who betrayed him. The town of Birka, about 15 miles west of Stockholm, became an important commercial center during the Viking period, long before Stockholm existed. It was located on an island in Lake Mälaren, which had access to the sea. Founded in the 8th century, Birka remained an active trading center for 200 years. Today, Birka has almost become a shrine to the Scandinavians. During the summer, thousands of visitors each day make a pilgrimage to this small island to hear guides tell about their Viking ancestors. The town of Birka no longer exists. Only the 3,000 grave mounds give evidence that there was once a flourishing community here. About 1,000 graves have already been excavated, revealing what life was like during the Viking era. Excavation is still going on, and the portable buildings contain laboratories for the scientists. And from here, iron ore, copper, furs, and amber were exported. In their places came glass from Germany, fabrics from France, silk from China, studded leather belts from Persia, silver coins from Europe and the Arab world. And from the excavations, furs, fine jewelry, combs, and ear scoops indicate that appearance and good grooming were important to the Vikings. Well, during the 6th century, old Uppsala was the burial site of 3 pagan kings. Following cremation, the remains were covered by huge mounds. Weapons plus silver and gold jewelry befitting a king were excavated from these mounds. And through their clothes and jewelry, the Vikings expressed their status in the community. Both men and women displayed their wealth in the form of beautiful gold and silver bracelets and necklaces. Finger rings were not common, and earrings were not a part of Scandinavian tradition. The Swedish Vikings followed a different route from the Danes and Norwegians. They sailed east and south into Russia. Novgorod, south of St. Petersburg, became a major trading center for the Swedish Vikings. An artist's rendition shows the way Novgorod looked during the Viking era. The Slavs and Arabs referred to the Swedish Vikings as Rush, from which Russia got its name. The Volkhov River that carried the Viking ships deep into Russia still flows through Novgorod. During the Viking period, this area was known as the Land of Rush. It's also reported that the Swedish Vikings were the only foreign force ever to rule Russia. Today, Novgorod is no longer a major city, but in the 12th century, it was Russia's largest. The city's past glory is evident in its Kremlin or fortress. Within its walls is the beautiful St. Sophia Cathedral with its gold domes and towers which were built in the 11th century. The Bell Monument was dedicated in 1862 to celebrate 1,000 years of unification of Russia. And it all began when the Swedish Vikings came to Novgorod to unify the many feuding factions in Russia. Around the Bell Monument's base are depictions of major events throughout its 1,000 years of history. The adventures of the Swedish Vikings reached south into the Black Sea and into the Byzantium city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. The Vikings marveled at the magnificent obelisk at Tutmos that was brought from Egypt 500 years before the Vikings. The emperor's private viewing balcony and palace. According to Arab chronicles, the Vikings were described as perfect physical specimens, tall as a date palm and blonde. The emperor's guards were no match for the Vikings, so the emperor, being a clever man, hired the Vikings to become his palace guards and to protect his treasures. The Vikings were well paid with silver and privileged positions, and this went on for many years. The throne room, where the emperor heard requests from his subjects who would sit on a bench of red cushions. Guests washed their hands from a gold water pitcher before being served tea in glass cups and gold cradles. This is just a small part of the emperor's treasures that the Viking guards were entrusted to protect. There's still a palace guard regiment consisting now of Turks instead of Vikings. They're used mainly for ceremonial purposes, but they can still be seen marching through the streets of Istanbul, wearing the honored uniform of the ancient palace guards. Trondheim was the Norwegian capital of the Viking kings, and King Olaf Tryggvason played an important role in bringing Christianity to Norway. In the town square, King Olaf looks over the city that he founded 1,000 years ago. Trondheim was built near the banks of the Trondheim fjord, and from here, explorers, adventure seekers, and merchants with loaded cargo ships sailed southward to the British Isles in Europe, but mostly westward to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Today, Trondheim is Norway's third largest city with a population of 150,000. Hanging pots of colorful flowers line Trondheim's main shopping street, but be careful, trolls are everywhere. Fresh vegetables and fruits come from as far away as North Africa, as well as locally grown produce when in season. And Trondheim's main bridge that spans the Nid River in the center of the city was built 100 years ago. Along the river's banks, rows of old warehouses have been refurbished into shops, attractive apartments. Although the city is wealthy enough to afford a modern bridge, the people of Trondheim value such relics of the past, as well as modern conveniences. Scandinavia's largest wooden building is now the king's official residence when visiting Trondheim. Trondheim's magnificent cathedral is where the coronation of Norway's kings have taken place since the Middle Ages. The cathedral was built over the unmarked grave of Saint Olaf, Norway's patron saint. There were two King Olafs in the story of Trondheim: Olaf Tryggvason, the founder of Trondheim, and Olaf Haraldsson, who came on the scene 15 years later. It was King Haraldsson who brought all of Norway into the Catholic Church in a rather heavy-handed way. he gave his people three choices: be baptized, leave the country, or be killed. Well, in the year 1030, in a fierce battle north of Trondheim, at a place called Stiklestad, in this very meadow, Olaf Haraldsson met his end fighting a large gathering of local forces. A church and cemetery were built next to the battlefield. And while Olaf's body lay in state on this site overlooking the battlefield, mourners witnessed a number of miracles. And since Norway had no saint of its own up to that time, Olaf was canonized and became the patron saint of Norway. Without fast seaworthy ships, the Vikings could not have explored and plundered distant lands. What proof do we have that these legendary ships existed? Around the turn of the century, Norway discovered 3 Viking ships that were the burial chambers of 3 separate funerals. At Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, one must admire the workmanship of the Vikings. In 1992, a full-size replica of one of these ships was sailed from Norway to North America. On October 9th, Leif Erikson Day, the ship sailed up the Potomac to Washington and to a presidential welcome. A side rudder proved to be more efficient than a rudder in the rear. Riveted planking with intricate carvings added an artistic touch to these sleek raiding ships. Although the Norwegian Vikings ventured south into the British Isles, Ireland, and France, their main thrust was westward. In the 9th century, they explored and colonized a collection of 18 islands between Norway and Iceland. Part of the coast was rugged and uninviting. But they did find good beaches where they could land their ships, and good farmland, and the foundations of a Viking farm show a large room with a central pit, and next to it was the barn, and down the center was a trough for animal waste. Boulders had to be cleared from the land before it could be cultivated. Vikings discovered sheep and a few hermit monks on the islands, and as a result the Vikings named these islands Faroe, which means sheep islands. Today the sheep population outnumbers the 47,000 Faroese living here, most of whom are descendants of the original Vikings. Tórshavn, with a population of 15,000, is the capital of the Faroe Islands. Fishing and the export of wool products have long been the major industries here. And Tórshavn's dry dock provides additional jobs and income. The Modern Information Office helps visitors enjoy unspoiled nature, bird-watching, and meeting friendly people. Tórshavn is a colorful mix of modern shops and traditional buildings, and in some cases, a modern building with a grass roof. The Faroe Islands claim to have the smallest parliament building in the world, and the only one with a grass roof. The Faroese enjoy home rule under the protection of Denmark. Their language is similar to the Old Norse language, but most also speak English. The exterior shell of this building is part of a residential development managed by the community. A person buys the foundation and exterior sidewalls at a modest cost from the community. The owner may then build his home any way he wishes. That is, the owner may work on his home or hire someone to build it, or a little of both. There is no restriction to the exterior colors, so homeowners exercise their imagination, and by this method, people of moderate means are able to own a home. Visitors to this small town of 15,000 can enjoy Tórshavn's modern shopping mall, as well as many other excellent facilities that you would expect to find only in a city 10 times larger. On the mall's ceiling, panels of beautiful stained glass art look down on the shoppers. On this day, a Russian grandmaster chess player was matching his mental skills against 10 other local chess fans. And almost every weekend, a variety of free entertainment is scheduled in the mall. These descendants of the Norse Vikings have built a comfortable, modern life on the legacies of their Viking forefathers. The Faroe Islands, together with Iceland, are the two most successful examples of Viking colonization. Wind-dried lamb legs in the mall supermarket are a popular dish among the Faroese. With such a small population on a collection of windswept islands, one would not expect to find such a beautiful facility called the Nordic house, built in a traditional style with a practical grass roof. It has an indoor amphitheater, 450-seat auditorium, large cafe, meeting rooms, and special halls for traditional line dances. Each one of the 5 Nordic countries contributed various materials toward its construction. And since the water in the lakes and ocean is too cold for safe swimming, Tórshavn's modern indoor swimming complex gets much use. Although the Faroese enjoy a modern lifestyle, there is a certain amount of nostalgia toward their Viking heritage, which is expressed in various ways. For example, young people routinely compete in boat races, but the boats must be of the same design used by the Vikings, with one exception: no sails, only paddle power. Competition is keen, and several boats cross the finish line almost simultaneously. Once the early settlers claimed the good farmland in the Faroe Islands, the Norse immigrants who followed had to look still farther westward, toward a large, mysterious island. Today it is called Iceland, but in the days of the first settlers in the 9th century, it was known as Thule. Iceland was formed by volcanoes, lava fields, glaciers, rivers, and waterfalls, which cover much of its surface. It's a land of rugged beauty. In the days of the Vikings, Iceland was well forested, but the early inhabitants denuded the forest. Attempts are being made to reforest the land, but because of the cold winds and the unsuitable volcanic land, they've not been very successful. The limited lands that are available are used today for food production and feed for animals. The first permanent settler on Iceland was a Norwegian by the name of Ingolf Arnason. In the 9th century, he sailed 800 miles from Norway through the treacherous North Sea. Ingolf's first view of this strange land must have been frightening. The hot steam billowed up from countless fissures, and he undoubtedly thought that he had reached the edge of Hades. Ingolf called his new home Reykjavik, meaning Smoky Bay. Today, Reykjavik is Iceland's modern capital with a population of 130,000, which is about half of the total population of Iceland. The original Norse people who came here were not plunderers, but settlers. In the following 1,000 years, they have been able to tame this unfriendly land and put the many harsh challenges of nature to their advantage. Today, Iceland is one of the most successful examples of Norse colonization. And in spite of a strong Viking legacy in both language and traditions, Reykjavik is the heart of modern Icelandic society. Icelanders enjoy a high standard of living, and nearly 90% of the people own their own homes. In spite of all of its urbanization, the residents of Reykjavik enjoy a peaceful, unhurried life. It's also a safe city in which to walk. The traditional architecture of past centuries borders part of the city's downtown lake and provides a contrast to Reykjavik's modern city hall. On a hilltop is a beautiful Hallgríms church in the shape of a giant organ, where concerts are regularly held within its nave. Iceland's Parliament building became the official seat of government in 1944 when Icelanders voted to sever ties with Denmark and become an independent country. Iceland has a fleet of 1,000 modern fishing vessels, including trawlers. The fishing and seafood industry accounts for 3/4 of all exports. Redfish, together with cod, herring, salmon, and smelt, are harvested from clean waters in the north. Iceland's seafood is highly prized in the international market. In modern packing plants, workers carefully inspect each fish fillet, after which it is quick frozen. It's said that the seafood diet that the Icelanders enjoy contributes to their good health and longevity, having one of the longest life expectancies in the world. Well, children in Iceland are loved and pampered, and child abuse is virtually unknown. In the middle of Reykjavik is a huge park and recreation center containing, among other things, a large free-form swimming pool that Icelanders frequent in both sun and rain. There are botanical gardens, picnic areas, children's center, and sports facilities. In Iceland, children appear happy and well-mannered. But it's interesting to learn that Iceland's illegitimacy rate is about 30% due to the custom of young adults living together and having children before getting married. This tradition has a practical beginning. When the country was an agrarian society without welfare and pensions, the survival of the couple in their old age depended on the ability to have children to take care of them. Therefore, a couple would not get married until the woman could bear children. This tradition dates back to the Vikings and continues very much to this day, even though Iceland now has excellent social aid programs. Reykjavik's Kringlan shopping mall can be an exact copy of our large city malls with some of the same franchise stores. 65 businesses ranging from the Body Shop to the Hard Rock Cafe make Kringlan the most visited shopping center in Iceland. A large supermarket on the lower level sells items from around the world. In the produce department, an electronic touchboard is connected to a computer-controlled scale. The customer places the produce on the scale, a square touchpad with a picture of the produce is touched, the computer calculates the weight and price and prints out an adhesive back price tag. And this supermarket undoubtedly holds the world's record for the most checkout counters a total of 24. You can shop for beautiful crystal, or toys. An arcade is popular with the young people. And famous Icelandic knit sweaters, scarves, and dresses with distinctive Icelandic designs are made mostly from wool. This is just one of several sweater factories that produce quality sweaters and coats from wool obtained from domestic sheep that outnumber the people of Iceland. Banks of stiff rotating brushes comb the knitted material, creating a soft Angora-like feeling to the Icelandic sweaters. Machine-made sweaters are equal in quality and sometimes better than the handmade sweaters that are sold in the handicraft shops at higher prices. In fact, a machine-made sweater is a more uniform knit than the handmade ones. However, if you want a sweater or jacket knit the way the Vikings did it, you'll have to pay at least 50% more. Besides being beautiful in appearance and soft to the touch, you'll have a warm garment that will probably last you the rest of your life. As in most malls, Kringland offers a variety of restaurants, some of which you may already know. A unique eating establishment is the Viking restaurant, where pretty maidens are apt to be kidnapped.
Jæja, komdu nú með okkur hérna. Já. Nei,
Within the restaurant, images of pagan gods indicate that you've entered the world of the Vikings. Fine wood carvings on walls and furniture give evidence that you are in a chieftain's hall. Guests wear cardboard helmets with horns, which are, of course, not authentic. Fermented shark meat, sheep's head, and testicles were delicacies in the Viking diet. Guests are served a sampling of Viking foods, but most prefer the steak dinner that follows. A few of the guests are given the honor of being initiated into the Viking clan. It was traditional during the Viking era, as well as in Iceland today, that the family name of the child was created from the first name of the father. If the father's first name was Gunnar, the children's last name became Gunnarsson or Gunnarsdóttir. Even today, the Icelandic phone directory is listed under the person's first name, then the last name, and finally the occupation. And Iceland allows the breeding of only one kind of horse, which was brought into the country with the Vikings. And this horse performs all 5 gaits, that is, walk, trot, canter, tolt, and gallop. The tolt gait, which is standard with the Icelandic horse, gives the rider the feeling of floating. The early settlers to Iceland could not have survived without this sturdy horse. Also, this breed does well on 1/3 the grass required by most other horses. To prove the smoothness of the tolt gait, the riders carried a full stein of beer around the arena and then gave themselves an obvious reward. The Icelandic horse is also used by the high priest of the Viking religion, who makes an annual pilgrimage to Thingvellir, the holy site where the Vikings gathered to pass laws and settle disputes.
Hail to the day, hail to the sons of day, hail to the night and her daughters. Regard us with kindness and grant all here victory. Hail to the gods, hail to the goddesses, hail to the life-giving earth. Grant us voice and wisdom and healing hands, as long as we all shall live. My name is Jörmundur Ingi, and I bear the title of Allsherjargoði, that is the head of the religion of our forefathers, the Vikings. They preferred to honor their gods outside in a natural setting, and we try to do the same whenever we can. We are here at Thingvellir, the most holy place according to our religion, and this is where we perform our ceremonies. The religion of the Vikings was replaced in the 11th century by Christianity, but the old way never died out. It has always been practiced by some Icelanders, and we now have a steadily increasing following in Iceland. There are also people both in the US, Canada, and in Europe that adhere to the teachings of the Vikings. The basic principles of our religion are that all men are responsible for their own actions and should live their lives in harmony with living nature. We believe that all nature is alive, the earth is alive, and every single thing in nature is alive. This is in some ways similar to the beliefs of the American Indians.
The Viking priest said that it's no longer necessary to die in battle to enter Valhalla, but paradise is open to those who succeed in life's struggles. Well, except for a band of asphalt passing through some of the wilderness areas, little has changed since the Viking era, and visitors will find beautiful, unspoiled areas in which to explore. Over 10% of Iceland is permanently under glaciers and ice fields, which are the largest in all of Europe and among the most exciting features of Iceland's scenery. Reaching a depth of 3,000 feet, they have been here long before the days of the Vikings. Here, visitors may take a thrilling snowmobile ride on a glacier. The tour operator will provide you with protective clothing and boots. You'll get a 5-minute lesson on how to operate a snowmobile, and away you go, playing Follow the Leader. That is important, since there are hidden fissures just beneath the snowpack. But your experienced guide will lead you safely through the ice fields and to a breathtaking world. Iceland is one of the most active volcanic areas in the world, and at the University of Iceland, scientists conduct research to uncover secrets of Mother Nature's violent behavior. An electron microscope peers into a microscopic world that may hold the secrets of volcanic activity. The scores of seismic instruments located in the ground in strategic locations transmit data by radio to these computers that analyze the results. Iceland sits on a huge molten lava bed. Evidence of this may be seen in countless columns of steam escaping through fissures. At a place called Blue Lagoon near Iceland's International Airport is one of many geothermal power plants that are producing both electricity and hot utility water from superheated water and steam forced to the surface under great pressure. The byproduct of this operation is mineral-rich water that is discharged into a huge holding pond that has now become a popular bathing spot for both Icelanders and tourists. It's claimed that the minerals offer healthful benefits for those suffering from skin disorders. In any event, it's worth settling down in the warm water and mineral deposits. Vikings undoubtedly took advantage of the hot pools in which to bathe. Water coming out of the ground at a scorching 300 degrees Fahrenheit will flash into steam if it's not kept under pressure. Over 85% of Iceland's energy comes from either hydroelectric or geothermal power. This power plant provides Reykjavik with most of its hot utility water and hot water for space heaters. Now, nature's hot water is too rich in minerals to be used as utility water. It must be passed through a heat exchanger that transfers the heat to mineral-free water that is then pumped through an insulated pipe to Reykjavik 21 miles away. The 1-meter cross-section of the main pipe is lined with about 4 inches of insulation made from lava through a special process. The control room monitors the amount of water Reykjavik will need. And although the pipeline is mostly above ground, the hot water during its 21-mile journey loses only 2 to 4 Fahrenheit degrees. To mention a few uses of geothermal heating, most homes, public buildings, schools, sport facilities, and about 80 public swimming pools are heated with natural hot water, as well as many industries. A glistening glass dome called the Pearl sits atop a cluster of 6 hot water storage tanks that supply Reykjavik with hot water. And inside, a fountain in the basement shoots water 4 stories high. The Icelanders have turned a potentially ugly cluster of water tanks into an attractive architectural landmark. The broad, curving balconies are used, among other things, for art exhibits, including quilts that are truly works of art. A full-service restaurant is on the top floor, and on the 4th level is a cafe serving sandwiches and pastries. An observation platform offers a panoramic view of Reykjavik. Agriculture has always been limited in Iceland. Today, only 1% of the country is arable. Consequently, many vegetables are hothouse grown, using geothermal water to provide the necessary heat. Everything can be grown this way: green leaf vegetables, tomatoes, hot peppers, squash, carrots, peas, even bananas. In fact, they claim that Iceland is the most northerly area in the world growing bananas. However, they did admit that it's not done commercially. At this horticulture college near Reykjavik, students learn to become successful farmers and flower growers. Iceland is truly a testimonial to the ingenuity of these Viking descendants who have built a successful life while living under great adversities, that is, harsh climate, volcanic eruptions, unfertile land, and huge glaciers. The search for the true story about Leif Erikson and his discovery of North America that he called Vinland must begin here in Iceland, at the Árni Magnússon Institute, which has the largest collection of Viking sagas in the world. The saga is actually an account of an event that is passed down verbally from one generation to the next. While the storyteller had an obligation to keep the saga intact, one must expect some changes and embellishments. While it's best to look upon the recorded sagas as literature, one must recognize that they have a basis in fact, although the sagas were not recorded until 200 years following the Viking era. The Árni Magnússon Institute is devoted to the study and interpretation of hundreds of sagas, and we've learned a great deal about life and customs as they were during the Viking era. The most famous book, dating back 700 years, contains the Greenland Saga, which tells about the discovery of Vinland, or North America, 500 years before Columbus discovered the Bahamas. This is the actual page where Vinland is mentioned. To trace the discovery of North America, we must return to Jæren, Norway, just south of Stavanger. This land has changed little in the past 1,000 years. It's still an important breadbasket of Norway, and today bands of asphalt have replaced the dirt paths. Cattle still graze the fields as they did during the Viking era. Modern combines have replaced the oxen and plow. But in the 10th century, a man by the name of Thorvald and his son, who was given the name Eric the Red because of his red beard, were farmers, as most people were in those days. The land was fertile and produced abundant crops. But the land did not always look this way. Norway's rocky land had to be cleared of boulders before it could be used for farming. And the boulders were often used to build fences and walls for homes and barns. This was the typical Viking longhouse in Norway, and it was this kind of house in which Eric and his parents lived. But one day they were involved in some killings, as the saga relates. It must have been serious for them to abandon their farm and home and sail 800 miles westward through treacherous waters to an island known today as Iceland. Eric the Red found fertile land on the west side of Iceland, and it was here where he built his home and farm. No one knows for sure of its exact location in this valley, but it was good land, and he fathered 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter, the oldest of whom was named Leif, the son of Eric, or Leif Erikson. Based on archaeological studies, this sod farmhouse is a reconstruction of a typical Viking farm in which Eric and his family must have lived. They owned cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. But one day Eric got into an argument with a neighbor and killed him. He was then banned to these offshore islands, where he in turn got into another feud and killed someone else. He was now declared an outlaw for 3 years, which meant that anyone could kill him without retribution. So he sailed westward through treacherous icebergs to an unknown glacier-covered land. This is what greeted Eric the Red. Eric spent his 3 years in exile exploring the area and establishing a personal domain. He sought out arable lands and laid out farm sites. Now he needed people. And 3 years later, following his exile, he sailed back to Iceland and told glowing stories about a wonderful fertile land that he had discovered. Eric was the first one to call it Greenland. He convinced 25 shiploads of people to follow him and his family back to Greenland. Unfortunately, only 14 ships made it. The others either perished in storms or returned to Iceland. And that small population of 400 to 500 was the beginning of the colonization of Greenland by Europeans. The year was 985. Vast ice fields and glaciers covered this strange land, but there was still enough ice-free land for those new settlers. In the next 450 years, the Norse population grew to an estimated 5,000, and then died out mysteriously by the middle of the 15th century. 1,000 years ago, the average temperature was about 5 Fahrenheit degrees warmer than it is today. The glaciers had receded somewhat, and there was more available land to grow hay for their animals. Eric built his farm on this land in a fjord along the southwest coast of Greenland. Today, only the stone foundations remain of the assumed site of Eric's home and barn, which was built in the exact same style as found on Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Here, cattle were separated by stone slabs. And sometimes boulders had to be cleared from the land before it could be farmed. Christianity came to Greenland about the year 1000. Eric's wife converted and built a small church on their farm, whose outline in turf is all that remains today. Later, a more imposing church was built of stone, but now in ruins. Today, a small church stands next to the first church site. Eric refused to give up his pagan gods, and his wife refused to sleep with him. About the year 1000, Leif Erikson embarked westward on a journey of exploration. The map shows the probable route that Leif and following colonizers took. 15 years earlier, an Icelander by the name of Bjarni Haraldsson, who on his way to Greenland was blown off course by a storm. He came upon the east coast of Canada, but didn't stop to explore the area. However, he did report his find to Eric the Red back on Greenland. Now Leif Erikson decided to retrace Bjarni's route. His first sighting revealed a treeless rocky land, and he called it Slabland. It was either the Baffin Island or the northern tip of Labrador. Toward the southern half of Labrador, Leif encountered a more inviting land of trees and sandy beaches, and he called it Markland, meaning forest land. Today, the Labrador coast is still wild and sparsely inhabited. Boat travel or the use of a gravel airstrip are the only links between the outside world and these isolated communities. Coastal steamers supply the communities with all the necessities from electric generators to firewood. Some communities may not even have a harbor deep enough for a ship to dock. There, the person who has placed his order by cellular phone must meet the ship out in the bay. In this case, a load of firewood was too large for the small boat, so the firewood was lowered into the sea, and the boat pulled the load back to shore. This is life along the Labrador coast. The coastal steamer stops at all the communities, large and small. The inhabitants have the same necessities as the larger cities: refrigerator, freezer, washing machine, TV, and VCR. Almost 100% of the people living in these communities are fishermen, and they are at the mercy of Mother Nature and the policies of the Canadian government. In recent years, the fish population has declined due to overfishing, so the government had imposed a moratorium on fishing in order to allow the fish population to come back to profitable levels. In the meantime, fishermen were paid for a period of time by the government not to fish. Along the Labrador coast, you will hear names of communities such as Indian Tickle, Spotted Island, or Black Tickle, which we will briefly visit. Roads through the community are unpaved. Nevertheless, trucks and off-road vehicles are common, even though there are no roads outside of the community. And they celebrate the same holidays, although the celebrations may last into summer. And each community has an elementary school, but high school students might have to go away to boarding schools. On weekends, the general store becomes a popular gathering spot. As Leif Erikson continued farther south, he discovered a land with mild climate and wild grapes growing. He called it Vinland, or Grapeland. No one knows to this day where it was. We only know that grapes did not grow north of the St. Lawrence River. However, Leif undoubtedly traveled farther south. The only authentic Viking settlement found in North America was discovered in the 1960s at Lanso Meadows, at the northeastern tip of Newfoundland. This is important because it verifies the presence of the Norse people in North America about the year 1000. These reconstructed Viking buildings are exactly the same type as found in Greenland and Iceland. Each building could accommodate 20 to 30 people. They slept in sheepskin sleeping bags on wooden platforms on either side of the hall. The long-handled iron grill was used for roasting meat and fish. It's believed that Lanso Meadows was a base camp that supported explorations farther south, as well as a place to repair boats before heading back home to Greenland with cargoes of lumber, raisins, and butternuts. The walls and roof were of sod supported by a wooden frame. All that remain of the original buildings are the foundations, now covered with sod. The most important discovery was finding iron slag and boat rivets totally unknown to the native population. Other finds included a Viking-style pin used to fasten an outer garment together. This stone world uses a flywheel for spinning wool proved that women also were here. The sagas also recorded the first Viking birth in this new land. The oxidized iron rivet and metal plate with a hole in it are the exact type as seen on Viking ships. Attempts at colonization were made farther south, but because of hostile Indians, the Norsemen finally gave up and returned to Greenland. However, periodic visits to North America continued for another 300 years. Back at Gardar, Greenland, Christianity had completely replaced the Viking religion. The stone ruin was once a storehouse that held the bishop's tithings. It's not surprising that the clergy became the wealthiest members of the community. And it's still a mystery how that 9,000-pound rock slab was raised above the entranceway. Although the nightless days of summer are few in numbers, the sun provides enough warmth to bring life to the Arctic wilderness. Even during the summer, icebergs are ubiquitous to Greenland, which is about 1/4 the size of the U.S., including Alaska. But nearly 90% is under perpetual ice, with only the coastal areas free of ice during the short summers. Julianahob, or what the Greenlanders call Qaqortoq, is the capital and largest town in South Greenland with a population of 3,500. A Julianahob is the main distribution center for southern Greenland, and after a container ship is unloaded as cargo, the containers are then sent on to the various towns. Most of the larger boats have reinforced hulls in order to withstand the battering of countless icebergs, which range in age from 10,000 to 100,000 years. The deeper blue the iceberg, the older it is. In the center of town is the only fountain in all Greenland. Obviously, it has a rather short operating season. "18 sculpture artists have changed the face of Juliana Hope's bare granite surfaces, and today, as you walk along the town streets and paths, you're greeted by stone carvings of animals, Inuit faces, and sea life. The sagas relate that there were many conflicts between the Norse settlers and the Greenland natives. However, the introduction of Christianity became a pacifying influence. One controversial saga relates that Leif Erikson introduced Christianity to the Greenlanders. Whether that is true or not, we know that Christianity came to Greenland about the year 1000. Today, Greenland's churches generally have a model ship hanging from the ceiling, undoubtedly an appeal to God to protect all ships. A fishing boat heads home through the iceberg-filled waters of Eriksfjord to Narsak, and South Greenland's third largest town, founded on a site where the Vikings once had their farms. The 2,000 inhabitants raise sheep, fish, and hunt seals. In spite of the countless icebergs, the summer temperature can reach 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The inhabitants north of the country call this area the Banana Belt of Greenland. During the Viking era, there was virtually no fraternization between the Inuit natives and the Norse settlers except for some trade. Today, the Inuit natives dominate Greenland's population. The ropes on which the children are playing are used by the men to improve their balance when paddling a kayak. There are no car rental agencies in Greenland, but local taxis are available. Boats and helicopters are the main links between Greenland's communities, all of which have no connecting roads. Helicopter landing sites can be anywhere. In the 13th century, it was decided that Greenland should be ruled by Norway's king, who declared an exclusive right to trade with the Greenlanders. In turn, he promised to send 2 shiploads of supplies to Greenland each year. His promise was not kept, and it caused great hardships. For centuries, control of Greenland has been in dispute, but in 1933, the International Court at The Hague decided that Greenland should be under the protection of Denmark, although the Greenlanders do enjoy home rule. Today, descendants of the Vikings continue to influence our world with great statesmen such as Dag Hammarskjöld, a former Secretary General of the United Nations, great inventors such as Alfred Nobel, and great explorers such as Thor Heyerdahl and Roald Amundsen, the first person to reach the South Pole. At one time, the Vikings influenced or ruled a vast domain from North America to Russia and as far south as North Africa. Viking legacies still continue to influence our world.